Hello and welcome back for another installment in our Courtroom Confidential Conversations series. For this episode, please join me in welcoming a former senior death investigator for the Fulton County Medical Examiner in Atlanta and a distinguished scholar of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University in Alabama, the host of the wildly popular podcast Body Bags, a true gentleman, and my friend, Joseph Scott Morgan. Hello, my friend. How are you? Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure, Josh. It's good to be here with you. I was excited, when you mentioned that this was a possibility. Your lovely bride, reached out to me, and I thought that it was a great opportunity to chat. You and I have chatted a lot over the past couple of years, and it's the first time that we've ever had this kind
Yeah,
of informal chat. I
yeah.
was saying
This will
earlier,
be
I'm not
fun.
I'm not having to feverishly dig through notes.
Yeah, we're not going to quiz you on some sort of ridiculous, awful murder case. We're just going to get into the nitty gritty of your whole life, if you're okay with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, sure.
I do really do want to thank you for taking the time, though, because you're a professor, you're a podcaster, and when you have all your free time in between all of those full-time responsibilities, then you're also, I see you on the news and on, giving commentary and with Nancy Grace and all these other folks. So believe me, I appreciate how busy a man you are. But before all of that, you were a death investigator. And my
Mhm.
first question is kind of tell us what that means. I think I've got an idea from the name alone, but what in the world attracted you to that line of work?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, first off, just so people understand, a death investigator is different than a homicide detective. And so, actually, the official term is a medical legal death investigator. And as you can tell, it's a combination of many things. Um, Homicides are all, they're all fascinating and that sort of thing. But after a while, homicides, to be honest with you, get a bit boring. I think some people might be surprised to hear that, because in my world, in the medical legal world, you deal with five manners of death. It's you know it's much broader than simply homicides. We deal with suicides and accidents and undetermined deaths and natural deaths. And to be honest with you, natural deaths were far more intellectually stimulating for me. Um, as far as my path, I did everything backwards in my career. I have kids now. I've been teaching. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I've now been teaching for 20 years,
Wow.
and I started very young as a death investigator. As a matter of fact, at the time, a guy named William Eckert, and people can kind of research his name. I was doing work with him when I first started, and he had been with the ME in New York, and he was at the end of his career. He became the chief ME for Wichita, Kansas, and then he worked with us in New Orleans. And he said, "You realize you're the youngest medical legal death investigator in the country."
Wow.
And truly, I had no business doing what I was doing. I just kind of dropped into it. I was going to college in New Orleans. My family is from Louisiana, and um, I was working in a hospital and going to school full time. And it just so happened that the morgue, it's weird how life kind of intersects. You get these weird little intersections. Um, I had uh, one of those moments in time where the morgue that the parish, they don't have counties, we have parishes in Louisiana, was being renovated. Or it wasn't, to say that it was being renovated is kind of an understatement, a gross understatement. It was being made to be functional again, because it was ancient. And they were using the morgue at this brand new hospital, and as you can imagine, the hospital administrator was not too happy about it, but they had an agreement. And I happened to meet the people from the from the coroner. They don't have medical examiners there. I met the investigator from the coroner, who wound up being my mentor and probably one of the finest forensic scientists I've ever dealt with. and a forensic pathologist that took me under their wing, and I just started volunteering in the morgue in my off time. Can you imagine that? Um, to mop up the floor, and there's a lot of mopping you have to do in the morgue. And, before I knew it, they had me closing bodies, then they asked me if I'd like to learn to open bodies, and then to do eviscerations, which is organ removals, then organ weights and organ dissections and all these sorts of things. And I said, "Yes, yes, yes." One of the things, and still I apply that tenet to my life today. I rarely, if ever, say no, because I'm not in a position to say no most of the time. There's certain things I just won't do, but it's every autopsy I ever participated in, Josh, was, I'll put it to you this way, the autopsy suite is the best classroom that I ever sat in or will ever sit in. I learned more in that tiny little space and, working, having my hands inside of an open body there, standing next to an esteemed forensic pathologist. I learned more in those moments than I ever did in any lecture that I've sat through, over the course of my career, and it took off. I became an investigator as well as continued to work in the morgue, and I read incessantly because I was so far behind the curve, I had to catch up, and, it was just like, uh, you couldn't do it nowadays. It wouldn't work that way any longer, um, and I wound up spending, I guess, probably 6, 7 years down in South Louisiana, and I got offered a position as a senior investigator with the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office in Atlanta, and,
Before
went
before you get there, let me ask a couple of questions because this is fascinating to me. You said you were in school. What were you in school for at the time when you got kind of handed this opportunity, if you want to call it that, to help mop up the floor in the morgue?
I was taking both courses in biology and criminal justice at the same time. There was no forensics program at all, and so I was kind of mending it together, or so stitching it together of my own accord. And I was always good in science and had a natural curiosity, and so anything that I did just further in the morgue further augmented my studies in a traditional academic setting. And then when I got into the field, working as an investigator for the coroner, again, the classes that I had, uh, were further augmented by what I was witnessing, even drawing up warrants, seeing that kind of
Mhm.
happen at a very young age. And I'm working, the thing about it is I'm kind of thrust into this environment as a young coroner investigator, and I'm surrounded in the field by all these really seasoned homicide detectives. I mean, guys that have been doing this for, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, and once I'd proven myself to them that I was a consistent, presence in their universe, they began to trust me and they defer to me at the scene and ask me, what do I think about this? And would ask an opinion of me at the scene. Now, again, those opinions were never necessarily written down. It could be the slightest nod or the slightest little comment about what I thought had occurred, um, to maybe give them direction in where they need to go with their investigation, because my investigation working from the coroner is completely different than law enforcement. I think people think that homicide detectives have this insatiable desire to be around the dead. They don't. The dead are only the beginning for them. Okay,
Right.
the dead are the beginning and the end for me, but for them, they're interested in who brought about the death, okay? And so they rely on people like myself in the field and, of course, back at the morgue to tell them what the dead are literally telling us through their mortal remains. And so I try to stay within the guardrails of my job. I never had a desire to go out and chase bad guys, or people always talk about, well, we've got to get justice for this person. I never understood that. That's not in my wheelhouse at all. I just want to know truth through science, the dynamics of injuries, disease. disease pathology in particular. I want to try to understand all of those things. I've got enough on my plate without having to worry about, what else might be going on.
um, I want you to explain for those listening and watching. What,
Mhm.
I think you touched on it, the difference between a death investigator or a coroner's investigator and a detective.
Yeah.
But my, I'm curious too. Is that something you went to school knowing you wanted to get into, or was this kind of a path where you're going for biology and all of a sudden this whole new world opens itself up?
The world opened up for me. We're right on a cusp back during that time in the mid '80s. We were right on the cusp of an appreciation for science. There had been an existent appreciation for science in the field. I don't want to dismiss that, but I think the portability, of highly trained medical legal death investigators, they saw the utility of us really for the first time in the field. I think to a great extent for the investigators that trusted us, they saw real utility in us that we could turn around answers for them pretty quickly because we are the eyes and the ears of the forensic pathologists in the field. And as years went by, there was a finer point put on that. And, you know, to jump ahead a little bit, that's where I got involved in a DOJ grant where myself and I think there were 11 other members of the task force. We were called the Milwaukee Task Force. We actually established the first uh, medical legal death investigator standards nationwide. And so that group was headed, the reason it's called the Milwaukee Task Force is that group was actually initiated by Dr. Jeffrey Jensen. And anybody that's into true crime might be familiar with him because he's the guy that did all of the autopsies on Dahmer's victims. And he
Wow.
saw a real need for a higher level of professionalism in our field. And so we established these standards. And now, uh, for many years now, there has been an organization called the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators, and it actually falls under the umbrella. It's recognized by the American Academy of Forensic Science, and that's certainly something I'm very proud of that I had a hand in, part of that task force. And there were people like I represented Atlanta. We had representatives from my old office in New Orleans, Nashville, New York, LA, I'd say LA, but Orange County, Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, Miami. I mean, we had these people from all over the country, and we all came from different backgrounds. And that was another big delineation is that you have coroner's offices, then you have medical examiner's offices, and you kind of do the same job, but they're administratively and legally they're completely different animals because coroners under most circumstances are elected and medical examiners are appointed. And most of the time, medical examiners, uh, particularly the administrators, are going to be board certified forensic pathologists, whereas coroners in some states can be elected with little or no education in sciences. You don't necessarily have to have any formal education to be a coroner. And so you have to start off at a real baseline of knowledge, and that's what we were working from with that organization and with those early attempts at it.
Incredible. So what you are doing though is different than a medical examiner or certainly from a coroner. What is it that a death investigator is actually you get called out, somebody's body is found, you get called out. What is your job and how does that relate to the then coroner or medical examiner?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So again, I defer back to we're the eyes and the ears of the forensic pathologist in the field. Contrary to what people see on television, forensic pathologists do show up at scenes. However, they don't show up at every scene. It's a very select group because there's very few board certified forensic pathologists in the nation, probably less than 500
Wow.
nationwide. People don't
Wow.
understand it. And it's one of the few practices in medicine where the more education you get, the more training you get, the less money you get paid. Because at the end, after an individual goes through a residency in anatomical and clinical pathology, they could stop right there and work in a hospital and do very well for themselves. They'd become part of a pathology group that would service maybe multiple hospitals where they're looking at slides and they're making diagnoses on tissue and they're running a lab, actually managing the lab. They go an additional year of to get a fellowship in forensic pathology, and you're going to become a government employee. That's what's going to happen. That's the end game. Now you can get out and you can do consultancy, and there are a lot of people that do. Once they retire, but you have to put the work in before you're going to have an attorney, perhaps that will retain you. You're going to have to prove yourself, and that means the grind of doing autopsies day after day. And you go to a big shop like L.A. Or New York, and it's nothing to walk in there, and they might have 13 autopsies in one day.
Wow.
And then you think, oh, your job's over with for that one day, and maybe you're not up on the schedule again for 2 days. Well, yeah, you're done for that day, but still those cases, you have to dictate all those, correct all the dictations. Oh, and by the way, those troublesome people called attorneys happen to send subpoenas, and you have to go testify on all of these cases,
Right.
or they want to depose you, or they want to come by and chat with you. And so you have a myriad of responsibilities in that world, and you're not dealing with the best circumstances. It's not some clean clinical environment. You're dealing with many bodies are in an advanced state of decomposition. So, as my wife tells my son, who's about to graduate from college right now, and we've told him for years, you got to want it. Wherever you are, if that's what you're choosing to do, you have to be in a position where you have to want it. If you want to be a forensic pathologist, I have kids that come to me in college all the time, and they say, Professor Morgan, I want to be a forensic pathologist. Okay, great. Go to medical school. Do 4 years of medical school, do 5 years of pathology residency, and oh, by the by, do one more year of forensic fellowship. And there's very few forensic fellowship programs out there. I was in Atlanta, and the fellowship is 2 years, is 1 year long, but we only had two slots, and one would go to a student from the US and one would be international. So you're competing for those two slots. Uh, Plus, against people not just nationally but internationally. And so if you can get, and then you have to pass the boards after you do it. So it's not something to be lightly undertaken. You have to want it. You have to want to be in there.
Wow. If we could step back for just a second, I'm
Yeah.
curious. The I know a lot of tough dudes. I know a lot of detectives, a lot of prosecutors and things like that. And the idea of being around a dead body is even kind of troublesome to some of them.
Hmm.
How did you react to that, or did that you're telling us about opening up bodies, removing organs, being on scene with a dead person in whatever condition that they're in? Was that something that you took to naturally, or something you struggled with?
Uh, let's see. Okay, so I have memories of my first autopsy, and even for me, in my first autopsy, just like with many people, I got queasy. But after I got past the shock of it to the system, my scientific mind kicked in, and I was able to clinically contextualize it in that environment. And so, the body at that point in time, um, and this is still something I teach to this day, that the body in any case is the biggest piece of evidence that you have. And I'm not disrespecting the dead by saying that. What I'm saying is that they make a lot of it's it Hollywood in particular, they make a lot out of saying, we speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves,
Hmm.
or we're the voice of the dead. And that's all fine and good, but from a clinical standpoint, there's a lot that we can learn from the dead, and that part of my brain uh, was satisfied with that. And I saw really horrific things. I think that I'd be a fool to say that I hadn't. I wound up participating in about 7,000 autopsies, I guess, over the course of my
Wow.
career, either actively or passively in the morgue, involved in those. Um, and then even more, deaths, just going out on scenes, scene after scene after scene. Um, I I I arrived, if I was in the morgue, or if I was just around the dead in the field, I had a real comfort with it. It was, there was a kind of a peace that kind of presided over me in that environment. It's when families got involved. That was the
Yeah.
tough part because, you know, one of the jobs that you have to do as a medical legal death investigator is make death notifications, and I think I made close to 2,000 in-person death notifications, and that's what really takes a toll. The last one I did was just as bad as the first one. They never got easy, and that really does take a toll on you, over a period of time. They're really hard. That's a very tough piece of road to go down. And look, every day you go to work, the potential exists that you're going to get your tail kicked every single day. Physically, it's physically demanding, um, particularly if you're working in the morgue. And when I was a very young man in the field, I was working full time in the morgue during the day and full time at night as an investigator because we had a very small shop. I mean, there were only 4 investigators for all of Metro New Orleans, and I had my jurisdiction went all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to Lake Pontchartrain, and dealing in swamps, dealing in the inner city. You would just run from case to case to case. I think my first weekend that I took call as a medical or a coroner investigator, I think I handled 24 deaths that weekend by myself. And
Wow.
that's not all homicides. There was suicides, and there were natural deaths, probably a couple of car accidents. But it takes its toll because with every one of those accession numbers that you have in the big book that you write down, that's a person. So you're bearing witness to the end of a life. You don't watch them die, but you see all that remains for 24 people in that moment. And I'm nothing special. There are people right now, as you and I are having this conversation, that are out there right now doing this job, every day, and it never stops. Death never stops, ever, ever, ever. You're, you're working every holiday. You're missing dance recitals and baseball and, a vacation. And it had gotten so bad for me by the end of my career that I was working 10-hour shifts, I think. So it's 4 days a week. And of course, no 10-hour shift is a 10-hour shift. You catch a case at your ninth hour, you're going to be there an additional 4 hours at minimum. Um, you're thinking about by the end, I was thinking when I would pick up my car keys heading for the door, I would be I would have a moment of of relief. I would sit down in my car, and then all of a sudden my brain would begin to think, I've got to be back here in 3 days. And I would be counting down the hours as I was off. I could never escape it. As death becomes like a constant companion, you've got to get back in the ring. You have to.
Wow.
There's no one else that's going to do the job. Now I did it for too long. I should have ceased earlier than I did, but
Yeah.
you know, here I am now.
um, Tell us about the transition from, because you go from the youngest death investigator in New Orleans, and then you eventually make your way to Fulton County in
Mhm.
Georgia. What
Yeah.
what brought you? What was that transition? Did that include a different title and type of work?
Yeah, it did. When I left New Orleans, we were a very small shop, but labor intensive because we had fewer hands on deck. So, I mean, just imagine if you were in a prosecutor's office and there were only, you know, 2 or 3 people in there prosecuting cases. You might not the whole office on the whole might not prosecute as many cases as, say, a bigger office, but still somebody's got to bear that load.
Right.
Same way with us down there. So when I got to Atlanta, it was a bigger staff, and Atlanta compared to New Orleans is very boring. I mean, for people that have ever been to New Orleans, I just got back. I was down with my family for visiting my family in South Louisiana for Thanksgiving, and I always love going home. However, uh, New Orleans has a reputation as being uh, uh, rather dangerous, and since it's a port city, you add that to it, um, and you get this huge eclectic mix of all of these cases involving. I've handled homicides that took place on Liberian registered tankers that were crewed by an entire crew of Koreans, and a guy, the chief cook, took his first mate in the galley and hit the guy with a cleaver 220 times,
Oh my
and then
god.
put him into the super deep freeze that they have in in the in that thing, and when they were coming around the Straits of Magellan, and then they didn't put into port until New Orleans. Well, there's that old. If you ever saw Goodfellas, there's that Nicky Carbone. He's hanging in the meat truck, and they said it took them. The narrator says it took them 3 days, to thaw him out, before they could do the autopsy. It took us 2 days to thaw that guy out before we could do the
Wow.
autopsy. That's not the kind of thing you're going to see in Atlanta, because you've got you've got everybody that lives on top of one another in New Orleans. It's the nature and that's why I love New Orleans. New Orleans is so unique in that way. Not the violence, but you're this big group of people that are forced into, living together from all kinds of different nationalities and backgrounds, and the poor live immediately adjacent to the rich down there. In Atlanta, you've got really, really poor people and really, really wealthy people. And then the city becomes a ghost town at night, the downtown area. New Orleans never does. You go out in New Orleans at, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning, you're going to see some guy walking down the street with a daiquiri this size drinking, and
Right.
he could be from Des Moines, Iowa, and doesn't understand the dynamics of the street down there. And it's a different world. It
Yeah.
really is. But yeah, my job changed in Atlanta from the perspective of, uh, it's a much larger geographic area than what I was used to. The lingo was a bit different, and plus, it was a medical examiner's office, which is completely different than the coroner's office. We in New Orleans, you used to have to campaign for your boss every 4 years, go out and put yard signs up and do all that sort of stuff to make sure that you would still have a job, because you were hired and fired at the pleasure of the elected coroner. In Atlanta, you were hired, and you were, hired by the chief medical examiner, who is appointed by the county. And in order to be the chief medical examiner, you got to be a board certified forensic pathologist. So there's a certain level of professionalism that kicks in there, that you become reliant upon. And so that, that was one of the biggest differences for me.
Was that what drew you there, or was it advancement, or what? It sounds like you're kind of kicking butt and taking names in New Orleans. What caused you to move?
Well, a lot of it had to do with a first marriage. That was probably a bad choice on my part. Uh,
Fair enough.
and and to be since we're being honest here,
Mhm.
and secondly, yeah, it was certainly career advancement, and it was an opportunity to have a better lifestyle, perhaps financially, than I ever would have in New Orleans. And plus, Atlanta was this place that back then that was just growing. I mean, exponentially growing. I wound up being on a member of the public safety. What was it? Let me get it straight. The public safety planning committee for the 1996 Olympics,
Oh, wow.
and and I that wouldn't have happened for me in New Orleans. It's just little things, kind of like
Mhm.
that. And interestingly enough, we had the Olympic Park bombing,
Yeah.
while I was there, um, and we had events that occurred, like that, and you had opportunities because there was a bigger spotlight, I think. And later, in my life after I had to hang it up, uh, if I had not been in Atlanta and taken my original academic position in Georgia, I never would have come to the attention of back then HLN. And that all happened because of Jodi Arias. I'd written my memoir, Blood Beneath My Feet, and I won Georgia Author of the Year in 2013 for the memoir.
Congratulations. I know
Well,
that.
thank you. and and one of the producers on HLN was actually, it was for the show that back then involved our friend Vinny Politan, who
Hmm.
is with Court TV, one of my oldest and dearest friends in the media. Um, they were looking for a medical examiner, and my name popped up in a Google search because I just won the book. I mean, I just won the award, and they said, "This is so ridiculous." Now I think about it. Said, "Yeah, we would like for you to come in," and I didn't follow true crime at all. I had no interest in it. I taught it all day long. I taught forensics and everything. I was starting a forensics program at this university I was located at the time, and uh, I had no interest. It's kind of like a busman's holiday. But they said, "We'd really like for you to come in and comment on this case about this woman who back in 2008 or whenever it was, I can't remember now, had killed her boyfriend and stuffed him in the shower, I think is the way and so they started sending me links and things like that. And um, I'll never forget, I walked into the studios in downtown Atlanta in the CNN building, which back then was still a thing, and it was massive. Um, Matter of fact, one little aside here, this is back when CNN had money, and they actually sent a limousine to pick me
Oh, ho.
up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia to bring me to Atlanta. I was thinking, "Hey, this ain't too bad." Well, I show up at CNN, and I've got like 2 stacks of manila folders that are like this size, and I'm carrying them like this, and and the producer looked at me and said, "What are
Yeah.
you doing?" And I
You're
was like, "Well, I've been reading for like 4 days,
I'm
and, to
prepared
make
to
sure
give
that
my
I understood
dissertation.
every de."
Yeah.
She said, "The segment's only 10 minutes long." And so, a guy that became my friend, Ryan Smith, who works for, I think Ryan's still with ABC. He's like a legal talking head for ESPN. So when athletes get in trouble, he'll talk about that.
Mhm.
And then he does ABC as well. And just a dear soul. I was really nervous, and he looked at me and said, "Joe," he says, "You're a professor, right?" And I was like, "Yeah," because he could see the fear in my eyes.
Mhm.
And he said, "Sit here and teach me." And that was probably the most profound advice I've received in media. I needed
Love
no
it.
other media training. So from then on, I kind of used Ryan's advice from all those years ago. I would just try to, still to this day, and hopefully I do a decent job, but I just try to teach people. I don't really have a dog in any of these fights. I just try to talk about the forensics, and as long as I do that, I'm okay. It's when I stray, when I stray off the
Yeah.
path, I get in trouble.
I love that. I love that. You touched on it a bit, but you did publish a book, your memoir. It's called Blood Beneath My Feet: The Journey of a Southern Death Investigator. You won the 2013 Georgia Author of the Year for that book.
Mhm.
But what inspired you to write this book? What did you where did you think that I need to put this all down?
It didn't start as a book. It actually came out as therapeutic ramblings. I was going through therapy. When I left the medical examiner's office in 2005, it was in the back of an ambulance. I thought I was having a heart attack for like the eighth time in like 7 months. And there were panic attacks. And this time they did put me in the hospital. And
Wow.
um, the cardiologist looked at me, and they'd done the stress test, the whole 9 yards, and they said, your heart's fine. You need to see a psychiatrist." I'm thinking, "Me?" It's like, I can do anything. I run with death. I'm around
Right.
death all the time. Um, and, because you think you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof, and, you've seen more. There's, you know, I, um, outside of my field, I put my reputation up against anybody's relative to the amount of death I've seen over the years. And so you have this false sense of self, and you don't realize it. And so when I began to write, and I was one of those kids in school. I don't know about you, Joshua, but I was one of these kids in school that I enjoyed English and literature, but I hated having that teacher that would say, "Okay, we're going to journal," and it's like,
Mhm.
oh God. I don't want to. I don't want to do this. Well, I sat down, and it became this kind of purgative event for me, to get this down on paper. Um, and it's not a very long book. I took, it's very nonlinear, when I wrote it, and um, when I wrote it, all I can do is draw on my life experiences and stuff that I'd gone through in my life compared to cases that I was covering. And there was always this kind of synergy between myself and the dead in a weird way. I know that sounds odd, but I could see a reflection of myself, in many of these cases that I covered. They really affected me. And you carry that around, inside of your head, because there were so many things I never wanted to tell my family, because I didn't want my family to be exposed to the same stuff that I'd been exposed to. You bring it home, and that's kind of it's a very familiar trope, I think, in public safety. You get these people that practice, they come home and they're very quiet. They don't want to talk to their spouse. They don't want to talk to their kids. They're hyper vigilant. They're always thinking death is around every corner. They're thinking that at any moment in time, the things that they saw happen on the street can happen to them and their family. And you live that life of fear like that. And so when I wrote Blood Beneath My Feet, that's the way I approached it. As a matter of fact, my wife Kim and I, God bless her, because she was with me all the way through this. Uh, we had planned on burning it. We were going to print it all off,
Wow.
burn it, yeah, burn it. And then one of her friends, that is she's now uh, a principal, um, an elementary school principal, and a creative writer. And she reads, and she's one of these. You ever meet these people that can read like a book that's like this thick? They can read it in a day.
My wife. Yeah.
Yeah, just voracious,
Yeah.
consuming books. And Kim looked at me and said, "We really need to let her read this." And she read it, and she said, "Joseph, you realize you've got a book here?" And I was like, "What?"
Hmm.
And sure enough, I began to, I kind of piecemeal this thing together, and wound up querying the book to a variety of places. Didn't use an agent, and I had a couple of offers on it, and I had one individual that saw the value in it, and decided to publish the thing. And that's the genesis of it. And it really resonated with people. I think that some people got really and it made me angry as well, to some of the comments, because some of the things that you would hear, because if you're in any form of public safety, where there's fire or policing or EMT, or in my field, people want to be entertained by you. You become, like one of these little dancing, monkeys, clapping the cymbals together. And uh, I would read reviews, and which you should never do. Uh, and it would say, um, "Not what I thought. I don't want to hear about his depression." And I was thinking, no, but you want to hear about the multiple homicide that I worked. You
Right.
want to hear about the guy that cut his roommate's head off and put it in the freezer. You want to hear about that, now don't you? But you don't want to hear about the price that has to be paid. I'm here to entertain you, you know? And so it that really struck a chord with me, I think. And um, I haven't written really since then. I wrote an article for Vice that wound up getting published in 7 or 8 different languages. And again, it goes back to my career. It was called Postmortem: The Life and Deaths of a Medical Legal Death Investigator. And I didn't even know what Vice was. My college kids, I'd come to this institution now, Jacksonville State University, where I teach now. And I asked my kids, this was many years ago, I said, "Have you guys ever heard of Vice?" Because I hadn't heard of it. And they were like, "Why?" I was like, "Well, I got contacted by them." "Oh my gosh, Professor Moore, you got contacted by Vice." And this is many, many years ago before they were in the state they're in now. And
Mm.
they said, "You got to do this. You got to do it." And sure enough, I wrote this thing, and it took off. So that just kind of bolstered, everything else I was doing in media, and I'd, I'd attained kind of a comfort level with it by then.
That's incredible. Did you know? So the book came after you left
Hmm.
your profession as a death investigator. Were
Yeah,
you working as a teacher at that point already?
yeah,
Tell us how that happened. How did you go from death investigator to now professor?
yeah. I had nothing. I literally had nothing left. I had been diagnosed with PTSD before it became kind of cachet
And
to
this is
use that.
from just the work had just built up in the recesses
Yeah,
of your psyche so much that it finally
yeah,
had a
and
moment.
yeah, and there were childhood things that I'd endured. Going all the way back, I think till, and I write about it in the book. When I was 6 years old, my father tried to murder my family, and
Oh my
me
god.
included, and he was hauled away. And back then, that was during Vietnam. He was given a choice: you're either going to the state penitentiary or you're going to join the Marine Corps and go to Vietnam. And he chose the latter. And so that happened. And then another person my mother married that was had a very negative impact on my life. So you couple all of that, and I started to see this kind of through line, as people in Hollywood like to say,
Mhm.
of in my life. I'm actually named after a homicide victim. My great uncle, who I'd never met, he was a homicide victim 13 years before I was ever born. And I'm named after him, and I'd heard all the stories about him throughout my life. And so you begin, your mind does weird things when you're around death, that world that you indwell, and you begin to see yourself as kind of lashed, I think, in some way to death. And in the book, I'd made kind of a half-hearted attempt to anthropomorphize death in the writing. And after I'd written the book, I saw um, the the movie with Anthony Hopkins and Brad Pitt, Joe Black.
Mhm.
Where death is in fact anthropomorphized in that story. And I was thinking, boy, I understand this. And you're dealing with these bigger issues, and you see it. You've got a different altitude, I think, than a lot of people's perspective when you've been around death. Uh, and maybe it's arrogance or maybe it's self-preservation. You go to parties and whatnot, and you listen to people talk about their lives, and you kind of keep your mouth shut, and you don't say anything, because it's like, whatever problems you're experiencing right now, the stuff I just saw today at work is,
Yeah.
yours really don't marry up to it. And even though it wasn't happening to me, it was happening to me. And it's kind of a weird space to be in. It
Yeah,
really is.
I've experienced more trauma before my coffee got cold this morning than what they're explaining in there.
Yeah.
That's
And
incredible.
so I had little or no choice. I had to, my wife, who was pregnant at the time, uh, when this collapse happened with me, she went and spoke to the county, and the county said, "Yeah, if you're thinking he's going to get disability for PTSD, you can forget it, because too many people can fake it."
Mhm.
So, it goes back to that, to the old adage about I had to grab my bootstraps and pull them up, and I had to fight through it and continue therapy and do those things. And I didn't realize what a commodity my skill set was. Not me personally, but just my skill set, the exposure. Because with forensics is like saying you're a physician. Okay. The next question should be, what kind of forensic scientist are you? Because the spectrum is so broad. As you know, this as an attorney, you can practice forensics in any number of different fields. With the in the medical legal world, we deal with a lot of different practices, everything from toxicology to DNA to ballistics to tool marks, to a motor vehicle examination, fire deaths, you name it. I mean, we're kind of that central hub, that everything else kind of radiates out from, you know. And so I'd had a lot of exposure as a generalist. Um, in forensics, and I knew a lot about these other things coupled with a graduate education that I knew enough to be dangerous. And back then, there weren't that many people that had a master's degree in forensic science, and it's a terminal degree. And so I had a university, it was the University of North Georgia, which is one of the 6 senior military colleges in the nation. It's kind of like VMI and Texas A&M and M and the Citadel and Norwich, and there's several of them. There's only 6 of them. Um, and they had a longstanding criminal justice program, but they wanted to add a forensic element. And so said, here I am. And they gave me the job. Um, and so I was introduced, and it was, I remember the time therapist was like, hey, do you think this is a good idea?
Yeah.
you know, you're going to be talking to kids right out of high school about this thing that's so traumatized and damaged you. And, man, as it turned out, it was a fantastic thing because
Wow.
every time I would go to the lectern, there was this moment of purging and therapy or therapeutic for me. I could talk about these things, and actually, my life for these students, I think to a great degree became a cautionary tale.
Wow. And how long has it been now that you've been a professor?
20 years.
Wow. Do you
It's been a
still
lot.
feel that kind of cathartic feeling talking about these
Mhm.
things?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, just today, we're in the first week of December, so we're winding down, fall semester, and I gave my last lecture in my medical legal death investigation class. I teach a medical legal death investigation class in our program, and today's last lecture was on notification of next of kin.
Ugh.
And so I had a chance to stand in front of an entire classroom and tell them what to watch out for, what not to do, how to go about doing it. And this is not something that you could, you know, that maybe you could take some psychology professor or some sociology professor or social work professor and stick them into that classroom with these kids that want to be forensic practitioners and have them teach this class. And they would have, forgive me, I know it sounds horribly arrogant, but that they would have the same impact. I know what it's like to walk into a living room and tell a mother that her son has just been gunned down in the street, or yes, sir, this is your daughter we found floating out in the swamps.
Uh,
We've just gotten her ID through her dental records. Um, I know what that's like. And the tactile nature of death. I explained, I talked to them about how, as uh, in our life, in our life, people do not believe it unless they can see it. Death is the best example of that. If you go and talk to some precious parent that's lost a child, their first question is not how. It's like their question is, where are they? Where are
wow.
they? I want to know. Where are they? It's a confirmatory moment because they don't believe you. And we as a species, we need that confirmation. We need to sense it. We want to touch. And Joshua, I've seen some of the most horrible things with families and the deceased, that people can't even begin to fathom that somebody would do this with bodies that are in advanced states of decomposition. And I was interviewing a lady one night, and I'll never forget this as long as I lived. And she had had an argument with her dad, and she came to his house after 4 months and found him dead. And when I was speaking with her, she had maggots crawling in her hair because she had rolled around on the floor with her daddy, grieving and screaming and tearing her clothes. And that at that primal level like that, people don't understand that, and that's something I can convey to my class to understand what this is they're about to step over the threshold into, what they're going to bear witness to. Because I can talk about it all day long. I think anybody could probably talk about it all day long, but I think that it requires a certain amount of experience that you need to bring to the table, particularly in that specific area. Um, and so, yeah, and I'm sorry I went a long way around the barn
No.
with that comment. That's very important to me. So, yeah, it is still therapy, and it's therapeutic in the sense I feel like I'm helping.
Well,
You have been warned.
yeah. No, you do such a great job of explaining kind of where the collision between kind of the academic side of something and the actual real life consequences of this work exists too. Because I'm as you were speaking, I'm thinking about, I as a prosecutor, you're dealing with murders and awful things and all the stuff that takes place. And you deal with it from a very kind of academic, how do I prove this? What are the elements
Mhm.
of the crime? How do I get
Yeah,
this? How do I get this moved into court? How do I mark this exhibit? And where everything would come to that intersection is after the conviction, after the verdict, and you're at sentencing, and now the victim's family gets to come forward and speak. And I don't care how long I'd been doing it, it would
yeah,
put you in the point of tears to hear these people talk, and you realize how real all of this is. It's not just a job and going through the motions, that these are real people's real lives are affected, and how raw it still is at the point of sentencing. So I cannot even fathom the moment of informing these people of that incredible loss.
yeah.
That
Yeah,
brings chills to me to even think about.
yeah. The first one I ever did was actually that first weekend, when I had 24 deaths. I had a young girl that was in a car with her boyfriend, and he was drag racing. He hit the median, in one of those little tight streets in suburban New Orleans, and the car flipped, and he walked away, and he had been drinking, walked away without a scratch. And she had just graduated from high school too, and she was essentially pinned in the car and died there. As a matter of fact, she died of compression asphyxia,
uh
which means the car was so crushed, she was still alive and aware, but she was uh, this kind of impingement that was going on for her in there. She ran out of breath, and I had to go and tell her father. And I still see the house in my mind, her father and her mother. And I still remember walking up the walkway to the front door. I still remember the leaded glass windows, um, and seeing those lights come on at 2 o'clock in the morning, those interior lights through the leaded glass, you can see them flip on when you're banging on the door. And I still remember that vividly. And all these years after that, I still see that. And so it's a real thing. It's a tough thing. And look, I mean, being in a room, locked up with dead bodies is tough. It's really tough, but they're the dead.
mhm.
They're not screaming anymore. They're not writhing in pain. The pain that a family feels um, goes on and on forever. That's why I really take exception anytime somebody uses the term closure. I despise that term. I hate it. It's dismissive. Because nobody in death, nobody attains closure. It's almost, I hate it because it's like this prepackaged term. You'll eventually have closure. This will allow for closure. In other words, "You've got problems, go away, I don't wanna talk about this
We're
anymore."
we're
Well,
we're closing those problems now. We're yeah.
yeah, yeah, and so I despise that, because
Wow.
families hurt so badly, and there's so much pain, and there always has been pain. This is not something new under the sun. There's always been pain, and, I don't I never wanted to do anything that would heighten that pain or intensify that pain. It's gonna be enough, and matter of fact, I used to say a prayer, uh, occasionally when I was lucid enough to remember it, but I would say bef bef uh, before I would go into a house, "God, if this ever happens and I die, please have the people that notify my family show mercy." And so I always wanted to be merciful and kind,
Yeah.
as best I can, because essentially that act that you're going through with that is like showing up at a total stranger's house and pulling a pin on a grenade and throwing it into that room and shutting the door behind you. You hear the explosion and the screams, and it just continues on, that agony, and it initiates with you. Even though you didn't have anything to do with the event, you're the one that is relaying this information. And it's hard to get past that because you're still there to collect information. Because as a prosecutor, you understand that that information you get from a family, sometimes it's the most critical information you'll ever glean in any case, because they understand the nuts and bolts of this individual's life. They know where they've been, what they've been up to. They even know what they've been eating or what time they were supposed to eat. We have to correlate that with what we find at autopsy. Does this marry up? Who are their associates? Are they involved in drugs? Have they ever had, do they have threats against them? All that stuff. And then you have to try to get that information amongst all of this turmoil. And it seems like it's all raining down on you at once.
That image that you said about like pulling a pin on these perfect strangers,
Yeah.
I think that resonates, and I can imagine too that you recall vividly the moments that you had to do this. I imagine to these folks too, they probably recall vividly answering the door and having you stand there and their entire life change. It's pretty.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, one instance I had a guy that he was decapitated in a motorcycle accident, and I went to his parents' house, came to the side door, which is the kitchen door, and knocked on it, badged him, said, "Need to talk to you," talked to the wife or to the mother and the father, and um they were just shattered. I mean, screaming, as you can imagine. This had been a witnessed event. Kid had been riding a motorcycle all day long on this grassy area and hit a uh, support wire for
uh,
high power, and took his head off in front of a group of kids, by the way. Uh, and 4 months later, uh, I got summoned to what had been a uh, barricaded situation where a guy took his life, uh, at a local, what we call a hot sheet or a no-tell motel. Prostitutes would take tricks in there,
mhm.
and this guy was a reserve deputy in an adjacent parish. This was in New Orleans, and they were trying to root him out because he had overstayed his time, and he barricaded himself. They called out SWAT, and finally, SWAT hears, bang. They force entry. He's laying there. He's got a self-inflicted GSW head, and I get his badge case out. Cops carry badge cases like this, and he had his license behind his badge. Took it out. I looked at it. And it's like, hmm, this address is familiar.
Ugh.
And so that night, I grabbed another deputy, and recall started kicking in as I'm going toward this address. And it turned out to be the same family. And the mother, this was late at night though, wasn't in the afternoon. The outdoor light came on. Mother opens the interior door, and there's a glass door, and she sees, and granted, this ain't the prettiest thing to look at here. She lets out this. guttural cry because this phantom has showed up. This evil phantom has showed up at her door again in the personage of me. And I had to
Ugh,
go in and tell them again. And this is prior to Katrina, way prior to Katrina. So, we're talking over 1 million people living, well over 1 million people back then lived in the greater metro area. What are the odds that this is going to happen? And it happened to me. And that's something I remember just going out to my car and weeping, after that happened. And so that was one of those moments in time. You know, the science the science is the easy part, Joshua. In my field, the science is really it's dealing with those that are left behind and having to convey information to them and still try to be as humane as you possibly can. You can't go out and hug everybody. If you did that, you would die. You don't have enough love in your love bank to go out and
yeah,
throw your arms around everybody that's grieving. You can't do that and still maintain your sanity. I have a family I have to do that for, that I love doing that for. Um, so you have to be very careful and judicious with how deeply you're going to go with this, because look, as soon as you leave that scene, guess what? There's another one that's waiting. It's
right.
going to happen. And so you do that day after day after day after day. There's no getting kitty cats out of trees. There's no finding lost children. It's death day in and day out.
God, wow. I've got chills just imagining it. Um, I don't have any great way of pivoting to this. It's a little more lighthearted, but I do want to talk to you about body bags. How did you
Yeah.
get involved in a you're now a professor, I'm guessing, and you how does this happen that you start this podcast? And by the way, for those listening and watching, do yourselves a favor. It's a phenomenal podcast and really growing in popularity. So please check it out. But how was
Thank
that
you.
on your was that was that in the stars for you, or how did that all come about?
Uh, Tip of the cap to Nancy Grace, that saw the value. I'd been appearing with her for years. I'd actually known her. I was with the Fulton County ME's office when she was a prosecutor. We
Oh
didn't
yeah.
know each other, but we knew each other. You're going to run across prosecutors; they're always coming to the ME's office, um, and so when I started doing stuff with HLN, and she had, of course, a long running show there. I was appearing pretty exclusively with Vinny Politan, and still do on Court TV with him regularly. Um, but she started asking me on, and we developed a friendship. And her bark is not as bad as her bite. Well, her bite is not as bad as her bark. Wait, hang on. What it? anyway, she's become a dear friend of mine now over these years, and I was appearing on her show, which she has and has had for a long time. Gets millions of downloads every month with Crime Online and Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, and uh, generally 2 or 3 times a week. I guess I've been appearing with her. I never say no to Nancy. And the reason I don't is that she's always been so incredibly generous um, to me. And so I was like, look, there's not a forensic scientist out there that actually has a podcast that I knew of. I'm sure that they probably exist now. But when the idea, this kernel popped up in my mind, I knew that um, I knew that it's something I wanted to do because it was an extension of teaching, and that's the way I
Hmm.
viewed it. And um, I I posed the idea to her, and I guess probably 3 or 4 months later, her team came to me and said, "Nancy had mentioned this to us. Is this something you're still interested in?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm very much interested in it. How often would you like to do it?" Well, I'd do one episode per week, I guess. It'd be fun. And I could prep and explore things I've always wanted to explore and um, people in that arena. Now I'm doing 3 episodes per week, and and it's really tiresome. I mean, it'll wear you out. It really will. but we came to a conclusion on the name, and actually my wife thought of it. We were at CrimeCon several years ago, and my wife said, "Why not call it Body Bags?" And the reason I call it Body Bags is that in our vehicles at the ME's office, uh, you had to take a body bag count because you had to keep the vans and the cars that we use stocked. And that was a literal measurement. It was, you could quantify that. That gave you a sense of how many deaths you were working. And so for every body bag that was taken out of the stack, that represented a death. And that's kind of one of the ways I used to measure my work. And it just seemed like a natural fit. Um, some people have been taken back by the title, and I don't really understand that. I'm not, I don't, it's not gruesome. I don't think it's, I guess I could have called it coffins or caskets or crypts or something like that. But body bags is what we deal in. That's part of the real world of what medical legal death investigation is like. Um, and so when I had that opportunity just to simply teach, and I've got a great co-host in Dave Mack, and probably got one of the best voices out there, a radio guy for years and years, and he's worked as a reporter for Nancy, and he and I are fast friends, and so we do all of our own production, research, everything, put them together. Dave edits all of these things, and it's met with great success. We're about to hit our 300th episode, which I'm
Wow.
very, very proud of. And I've gotten to I do cases that are current in the news. I do stuff that is uh, uh, primarily, I try to stick with adjudicated cases, but there will be cases that'll come up, like, for instance, the missing Kansas moms. Just
Mhm.
finished the second one of those today because the autopsy report has been released on the second mother. And Billy Wagner from Pike, Piketon Massacre, which I've been involved in that podcast for 4 years. Um, they just moved his trial, and he's the last one of those defendants from the Piketon Massacre to be tried. That's happening in January. But my big thing that I'm on right now are Othram cases. I love what Othram is doing. I'm a big supporter of theirs, getting bodies identified. I'm fascinated by those. I like to do historic cases. One of my favorites of all time is probably we explored the autopsy of Julius Caesar because his was the first documented autopsy ever done, and people are fascinated by his assassination, and we talked about that extensively. Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, you name it. So we'll do historic figures as well, but from a death investigation perspective. I try not to get off into like family dynamic and all that sort of stuff that a lot of people explore on their podcast because I'm a forensics guy. And the way I look at it is this: I've been very blessed with the opportunities I've had professionally. I've gotten to go behind the curtain, see, like people are curious about the morgue, they're curious about death, they're curious about forensic science, and not everybody has that chance. And I run across these people all the time. I'll have people, housewives that'll message me and say, "God, I wish I was college age again. I'd love to take your classes." Well, yeah, I mean, that'd be great, but let's just have a conversation. And they might not get a degree, but I can at least, from my perspective, teach them a little bit and maybe extricate some of that frivolous stuff that they hear in fictionalized television,
Mhm.
in true crime, not true crime, but in, you know, you know, crime shows, those sorts of things, and try to, talk about what, form and function, how it really works. So I take a lot of pride in it. I'm very pleased with it. So yeah, it's been quite the journey. It sure has.
What do your students think of it?
They're fascinated by it. They, uh, I've got, fans. The students have brothers and sisters that listen, moms and dads that listen. Uh, we've had an opportunity to actually recruit with it for Jack State. I've got kids. I had a dad and his daughter that actually showed up at campus for one of our recruitment days, and they'd driven down from Michigan to Alabama and said, "We're here because of body bags." And so,
Wow.
yeah, and a lot of that is credited to my university, not just with body bags, but also with the stuff I do in the news. This is always behind me.
Hmm.
I know who keeps the lights on. I'm so grateful to them for what they've done for me and my family. And it's just a pleasure, to support my institution that I love, uh, because we've got all these cool things going on, and I'm even getting a cadaver lab now. So I'll have undergraduate students that'll get to participate in a human dissection. We've got digital forensics labs, and we've got a crime scene house within this old building that we have that's got, I don't know, 9 different rooms in it where we can adjust it to, whatever we want. Trace evidence lab, all these sorts of things that are kind of happening for us. And we're kind of a one of a kind, unique entity in our little region that we're in. So we produce what I refer to as lab rats and field mice. Field mice collect the evidence, and then the lab rats bring it in and process it. And so it's been a glorious journey for me, that's for sure.
It sure sounds like it. In the last few minutes I've got you here, you've kind of touched on it, but what is next for you? Do you have anything in the works? Anything you're excited about coming up?
Well, I just finished taping um, several episodes of, believe it or not, of Buried in the Backyard. I've been involved with that show
Nice.
for a while. I've got a couple of things. My Blood Beneath My Feet has been optioned, and I can't go
Oh,
too much further than that. So that has been a real treat to be involved in that process, no matter what the outcome is. And then Body Bags, I think, is going to have space on television, and we're very excited about that. And again, it'll be hopefully it's going to be about teaching forensics, maybe in the true crime genre on television. Very excited about that, and we'll continue to expand the podcast. It's hard for me to say no, Joshua. They asked me for 3. Now I'm thinking about giving them 4. So I don't know if I have the constitution for it, but if it wasn't for my family and my wife and my grad assistant that I have, and all the support people that make it happen. I couldn't do it. There's no way I'd sit around in a puddle. I just couldn't do it. We do have kind of a common vision of where we want to go, with this trajectory. Um, and every opportunity that I have to get out there and kind of proselytize about Jacksonville State, everything builds upon one another along the way. So, and I've got another, exciting project that I've just filmed. I can't say anything about it right now, but it's something that is going to be dropping probably in the next few months. And I'll promise you'll be one of the first people
I love
that
it.
I'll tell, and you can push that out to your audience and let
Uh,
them know. But I'm very excited about that as
I'd
well.
be happy to. I'm very excited for all the stuff you've got in the works, and I wish you the absolute best of good fortune for all of those things. Tell everybody where can they follow you? Where can they find out more about what you're up to so that they know about these exciting announcements?
Yeah, so I'm on, I think, I'm on Twitter or X, is Joe Scott Forensics, I think is my handle there. Joseph Scott Morgan, I'm on Instagram. You can find me there. Generally, particularly on X, I post every new episode. We drop on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays every week. And every now and then I'll add a bonus episode. We're on iHeart and Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. I don't have a YouTube channel at this point. Again, that's another heavy lift
Gotta get
that I
on
don't
there.
know.
Gotta get
I
on the
don't
YouTube.
I don't I don't know if well, I might be demonetized because I talk about some pretty rough things, so I don't know how easily I could transition into that, but, the podcast space has been great to me. iHeart has been very good to me, and we're very pleased with that and our relationship with them. But on all of the platforms, everything, relative to Amazon, we're there. So, please reach out. And what really helps us is, and everybody says this, but review and rate. On Apple in particular, I guess on Spotify, but Apple in particular helps us a lot.
Yeah.
Please come over and follow me on social media, and I'll keep you posted on what's happening.
Joseph, my friend, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really learned a
Thank you,
lot.
Joshua.
You have a fascinating background, and I love everything that you're up to. And I hope that you continue to find the energy to pump out more stuff because everything you do is fascinating. Thank you again
Well,
for
thank
coming
you.
on, my friend.
Thank you, Joshua.
We hope you enjoyed this interview. If there is someone you would like to hear from, a well known creator, or perhaps someone you feel that gets overlooked, please let us know in the comments. And please check out our playlist of past conversations. As always, we appreciate you all. Please remember to like this episode and subscribe for more content like this. And thank you again for joining us for this episode of Courtroom Confidential Conversations.